So I am going to stop sharing that screen and we are going to jump back into what we're building next, which is this look. So this is our TVs, a bit of a glitching out sort of effect. Now, this is a combination of a few of the things we talked about earlier. So before we talked about putting some post effects on just the video before we added the cloners. Now that's what we're doing inside these screens. All of these screens have a bit of a glitch sort of effect on them. The other thing we're doing is this TV model that's been provided has separated materials. So we can run one of those materials directly to the screen, which is what we're doing here. We've also added a bit of a delay. So you'll see when I move my hand, there's a little bit of delay there. It's just to add a bit of visual interest. For a band, you may not want to do that, but when it's just things like an IMAG of someone talking like this, it just helps break up the feeling that they're all the same look. So the node graph for this one is a bit bigger. One way, if anyone's wondering how I'm going full screen on the visuals here, F9 on your first screen will actually bring up your output in full screen, and F11 will bring up your node graph in full screen. So this is the best way I can do an overview of the node graph. So coming in here, I was going to stop the video that's playing next to me. It's a bit distracting. So coming in here, we have a cloner system again, but this is a grid cloner system. Now we've also, you'll see that these are all color coded. Notch lets me put things in regions, so they're a bit more clean and clear to optimize. And this is something we'll run through after this session. So jumping in, we have the same thing as before, a video input. That's my IMAG screen coming in, my camera feed coming to me right here. This is running into, on one of the TVs, running into the same switch we had before and being blended in with the video in. But here you can see I've added some contrast, I've added some hue rotation, and I've added some frame delay on one of the two TVs. This, instead of then running to an image 2D or to a cloner, runs to a material. And this material in turn is fed into the TV. If I turn the material off, the screen will just glow the default color. What we also have here is one of the other materials, which is the shell of the TV, which we have made run as a truchette sort of look. And the truchette is one of the other generators. So we're using the generators inside to put the animation on the outside of the TVs. There is also a bit more animation happening with our camera. There is some math effectors moving the cameras in X and Y position. And I think besides the post effects, that's pretty much most of it here. So we're going to jump in and start building this look now. Oh, also, if anyone was interested, the countdown look was actually built and running fully in Notch before I rendered it out. Just a continuous modifier counting down some text nodes and some turbulence. So that does run in Notch. We just made it as a video for safety. So jumping into the TVs compile, we're going to go into the TVs blank. Okay, now this is the part where I'm going to say this is a bit of a hectic and computationally intensive effect. So if you're coming down here and noticing that your frame rate is a bit low, you may want to come up and change the resolution scaling here. This RES button will let you halve the pixels or quarter of the pixels. Now, again, talking about frame rate's really important for locking for these effects. And you may find that I may have left this locked when I sent the file out to you. If you click on this little P down here next to the timeline counter, you can see your frame rate limits. By default, Notch goes from 0 to 999. And what you'll see on my machine is my frames per second will jump anywhere between 60 and 200 for this particular effect. It's a bit lower as I'm screen sharing and I'm also capturing this live. But what we're going to want to do is limit this, in my case, to 60 frames a second. Because that's not going to be, my computer can't refresh this any faster on my screen, and that's what I'd be outputting to another output anyway. So there's no point in taxing Notch, making it render far more frames than it can actually display. if you're finding this is really running slow and your computer fans are starting to spool up, feel free to drop that down the maximum level to 30 and to come into this resolution scaling and even drop it all the way down to quarter pixels. You can still work along, it's just not going to be as clear. So I'm going to revert back to 1 here, and we're going to come into our blank. So F1 again, once you've got it selected and soloed, will take us into the blank thing here. So we want to start again. We're going to go in and, oh, thanks to start. Yeah. We're going to go in and do the similar things we did before. We want to bring in our video input, our recorded input, and our video switcher. But instead of doing all of that from the start again, we can actually come into what we built previously, our hologram blank, F1. We can come in and we can say, disregarding that, selecting all of these objects, Control C to copy them, and we can copy across different files. So we come back into our new layer here, F1 to enter, Control V. Now this is basically just a copy, but we don't always want to do this every time. There is a system inside of Notch that allows us to save these little snippets, and they're called bins. Down the bottom here, you'll find not only your preferences and your project settings, but the bin option. Now you'll find in Notch that there are quite a few tools that are already built in here that we can drag in. Some different lighting setups come with it, some different tools. I've got some of my personal ones in there that look at lighting. But how do we create this instance? If we select all the nodes we want to make into an instance and press Control G, that'll become a group. Now this group is useful. You can copy groups between things, but the best part of this group is we can rename it. So if we click on the group at the top here, press the F5 key, which is the universal rename key across Notch, and let's call this video in switcher. Okay, now this group here will move around together. It's called video in switcher. If we right click on this group and send to bin, this will then say, what do we want to name it? We're going to call it video in switcher. And we're going to say the folder we will create is called video input. What we'll find now is over on our bins option here, again, if you haven't got that visible, down the bottom, select bin, so it's glowing. We now have a video input folder created and a video in switcher there. So even if we delete this, any future projects we have, as long as we've saved this on our computer, we can just drag in our video in switcher and we're starting straight away. Bins are great because you can send these between computers and you can send these to other people as well and export them. So if you're trying to send just a sample of a section of a file across or share what you've found that's a really interesting way of achieving a solution, save that as a group, export it as a bin, and then you can actually send those bins to other people. Now you can use this inside the group, but it's generally not as useful. So if we click on the group again, Control, Shift, and G. Okay, I've chewed through 8 minutes of my time just talking about this one section, so we're going to put our feet on the gas and go a little bit faster. So again, we're going to use an image 2D just to set up our post effect looks. So IMAG 2D, bringing that in again from our search nodes. We are again also going to put 2 video nulls, sorry, in line. And again, this is here because we want to have certain effects apply to certain stages. Now, I recopied this by highlighting it and pressing Control D. You can also do Control C and Control V, or you can drag a fresh one out. Again, we want to feed this into the image 2D video node, the image 2D here, press Control R to link that in. Here we go. I'm going to jump off of the camera here because it makes me feel nicer. And let's start putting some more distortion-based effects on this, because this is when a TV, we really want to have that TV sort of glitching out a bit. So we want to come into all the way down the bottom here, our post effects. So we can come in here and have a look at a few different options. RGB distortion's a really good one. So let's bring this in. And in the first video null here, let's bring the output in and bring in an RGB distortion. Now, that's a little bit intense, just a bit, but we can tweak the amount down. We can change the blend amount as well. But the other thing you'll see here at the bottom of this RGB distortion, and a lot of post effects have this, is a mask image. Now, before we were talking about our generators being things like the gradient mask, we can definitely drag that in and have a gradient appear where we're doing our noise. Basically, where the white is, there'll be noise. Where the black is, there isn't. We're not limited to simple gradients. We can come in and say, all right, I want to have a fractal noise as my mask. And again, let's bring this open. So shift, double click on it. At the moment, this is just a simple FBM noise, but we want to make it a bit more intense. So let's say we're going to turn our threshold much higher. Let's say our gain, we will set to maybe 3. And now you can see that sections start to get affected. Again, this is operating only in the 256 by 256 at the moment, so we can go 1920 by 1080. And now we're starting to get little bits of it start to pop through. Maybe the threshold's probably a bit much. There we go. Noise scale. Drop that down. And let's maybe blend it out a little bit less. So now only sections are being affected. So that's cool. Why don't we try adding some color effects to it? So before we saw there was a color correction, but there's also a recolor node. So if we come in here, REC, recolor. Again, this is going to be looking for a source image. In our case, it's going to be a color ramp. And as you would expect, it's going from white to white, so it's going to be black. Sorry, it's going to be fully white. Let's add 2 extra additions here. So again, the back one, our blacks will be black. Then we want to say, maybe we want to go to a dark purple. Then we maybe want to say, we want to come to a pink, and we want to end on a yellow, something really extreme so to look. So now this is completely color correcting all of this. And we can disable these as we need. But this is a good look. One more look I will definitely add, because we are going for the older TV look, is something called VHS scan lines. When we bring this in, it's going to look a little bright. We don't need to change the scale in X, so make that 0. And as we bring this scale in Y down, we start to see those old lines start to appear. F9 to view it. It just helps to break that image up a bit more. Maybe about there. And change the intensity a little bit. There we go. So this is adding a really, really intense color grade to our look. Probably a bit more than we're after, but I'm riffing here, so let's see how we go. All right, now we're going to bring in our TV model. So we can turn off our image 2D, Control 1, bring in our TV. Now, if we come up to the top here, there are a couple of different render modes inside of Notch. One of them is deferred rendering, high dynamic range. But we're not going to worry about that too much yet, because we need to connect our TV to the root node. Now, what's going on? It just looks like a box. If we press our 5 key and orbit round, we realize the TV has imported itself upside down and facing the wrong direction. So let's create our camera as we did before. Connect it to the root node, 0 key to highlight it, and just bring it in Z, let's say -10 all the way out. This is actually quite a large TV. What we want to do here is we want to change our pitch of the TV to -180, so it's facing the correct direction. Now, we don't have any lighting on this yet. So let's say we want to put a directional light, DIR. I generally like to keep my camera and my lighting on the left-hand side just for easy finding. So we connect our directional light to the root node and maybe give it a bit more of a pitch down. So it's from the top and a bit more from the side. Now our TV is huge. How do we fix that? Again, select our TV geometry node. So this is probably really small. Select our TV geometry node, press the Y key or navigate up to the top here. It says uniform scale. Select that, click in your viewport and just drag around and you can bring your size of your TV down. Now the TV here, because it was imported as an FBX, actually has the mesh model nested inside of it. And all these inputs down the bottom are the different materials. So if we come across to our material inputs here, we can find there's a bunch of materials already made for Notch. We're going to use the standard ones though. If we drag in one material, take the output and feed it into the first input, we can see that is our screen. So if we're looking here, again, 5 to look around, we've just put an address and a material to our 3D object. If we take the output of this video null we made earlier and bring it into the color texture, which is the first left one, we now have our image coming into the TV screen. I'm going to take these effects off as they're a little bit hard to see. We'll also see, again, this is coming in upside down. Because our TV did import itself the other way around, this is not ideal. So what we're going to do again, transform image node, connect it to our last video null, and then change our scale to -1. Now our image is coming in the correct way. We're also finding that this image is affected by lighting, and we want this to be an emissive screen. There's two ways of dealing with this. Inside our material, we can actually come in and change the emissiveness of that material so it glows. The alternative way of doing it is to uncheck the lit node, which means no matter what, even if we turn off the lighting, that screen will always stay the same brightness. I'd choose to use the unlit version. Okay, this is the start. We have got our TV lit. We have the signal on there, and we add a few more materials to it. So this is, we're going to say, is our screen material. Click it, F5. I like to call materials MAT_screen. Okay, that's our first material. The second material, again, MAT, we're going to drag in. This material is going to be the body of the TV. So we can jump into here and make it something like a really, really metallic, reflective look. But what I'm going to say is let's recreate the look we had before, come into our generators, come all the way down to the bottom to the Truchette node. If we take this output and plug it into our texture, it's mapped across. And you know what? I'm going to add an ambient light as well. This will just add even lighting to every surface. I'm just going to turn that brightness down a bit, just so we have some nice lighting on the sides without getting too intensive. Okay, so we've got this pattern across everything. Truchette has a couple of different options in there, and one of them being the rounded option. We can take that off, and now we get a closer look to what we had before. Now we can keep this as black and white if you want, but one of the ways I like to do it is taking a color ramp input and now, again, it's currently white because it's white and white. We can make one of these a bright pink and one of those a black. And that's a little bit closer to the TV we had before. So if we hit spacebar, the TV sort of sits in place. The video is playing on it, but it's not really doing much. And there's only one of them. So this is where we start looking into cloners. What I will do before we jump too further ahead is I'm just going to add 2 more materials just so we have everything linked in. So one more material is going to go to the knobs. I'm going to make that a yellow. And the final material is going to go just to the selector bar. And I'm just going to make that maybe a blue, like a dark blue. I'm just going to take this time just to organize these nodes. Again, I find it easier if you press the F11 key and it brings up just the node graph, so you've got some more space. So this first one is our matte screen. The second one, F5, we'll call our matte TV body. The next one will go matte round knob. And the final one, matte selector. Just so we can see everything in here. Okay. Okay, pressing F11 will bring us out of that full screen mode. And now we can jump into our cloner. Okay, we're at 6:20 here, so we got some time. So again, we looked at cloners before. We want to go in here and now take just the base cloner, not the clone to volume or clone to particles. We can cover that later, but the base cloner is what we want. So bring this in and look in our options here straight away. So our base cloner gives you the ability to move the cloner around in space. Choose what type of cloner it is, a 3D grid, a radial cloner, or an iterative cloning, which means you can send something off in a direction and keep repeating. And then down the bottom here, we get to choose how big our clone grid is, how many clones wide, how many clones deep, high, and any offsets. The way the cloners work, as shown before, we need to connect it up to the root node, Control R, and then we need to feed the output into an object. So at the moment, this TV is connected directly to the root node. If we press Control and Shift and wait till that goes red and click, it'll remove that connection. If we now drag the output from the cloner into the TV, it's going to get a little crazy because there is a TV currently sitting on top of us. Pressing the 5 key and just pressing Alt and scrolling out will let us see that we've now made a grid of 3 by 3 by 3 TVs. Could be cool in its own right, but it's not the look we're looking for. So coming back into our cloner, we want to say that we may want to have 3 by 3, but we only want 1 in depth. So 1 in depth, that cleans things up. Now when we look at the clone offset scale, which here is the grid size, X, Y, and Z, it's saying the size of 10. There are 2 ways of scaling your grid. You can leave it as total size, so the entire width of this grid across will be 5 units or 10 units. The other option is coming in here and clicking and saying size per clone. And now we can bring it in and get it really tight. The advantage of going size per clone is if we adjust the amount of clones, they all line up nicely. Whereas if it was still on the total size and we adjust our number of clones, they'll all stack up on top of each other. So again, we're going into our cloner node. We're scrolling down to our grid option here. We're changing our grid count to 7. And we are going to change the grid size mode from total size to size per clone. And it works out roughly to be 3 for the gap. Okay, so now we have 7 clones in X, 3 clones in Y, and 1 clone in Z. If we scroll out further, we can see these are very far separated again, because it's saying that per clone, we want 10 gap between. So let's just drag that back down. Okay, again, we are still in pressing the 5 key. If you hover up the top here, when I say the 5 key or the 0 key, up the top, there is all these options for scene cameras. The 5 is the general orbit camera default in Notch. So you can look around without changing your other camera presets. If you hold down the Alt key and press your middle mouse button, you can actually pan around as well. So say we have this look. Let's make it 5 high. Oops, sorry, Control Z. 5 high instead of there. Now in our previous look, if we go back to our complete, it actually shows these being offset. Now, how do we do that? So if we come into our cloner, there is actually a stagger option built in, and we can stagger these vertically. Oops, sorry, stagger these horizontally because there is nothing in Z space. And now we see that we can pull these across and get them to line up almost half and half like a brick wall pattern. And that helps, again, just breaking up that feeling of just a grid, because your eye is always going to be drawn to, that's just a grid. It's the same object over and over again. We can help trick that by just slightly offsetting it. Okay. So now we have the TVs in a grid, offset, playing an image. But what if we wanted to add another TV? Will it be much more input? Well, let's just take what we have down here. If we select everything we've made for our current TV, duplicate that across, and we now connect that cloner in, it won't look like it does much. But if we come into our color ramp here, we've now made a second version of the TV, and that's going to iterate between the two versions as it clones across. That's how we get our stepped look. Now we can make numerous TVs. We can make 3, 4, 5, as long as they're all cloned in. Oh, sorry. Make sure only the top is selected when you are connecting it. And we can make this a yellow. You'll see that it'll iterate between pink, blue, yellow, continuously across. One cool thing with cloners, though, however, is if you have more than 3 objects as the child, you don't have to leave it as iterate up here. You can actually set it to random, and it will randomly assign one of those 3. I'm going to keep it to iterate, and I'm going to make it so there's only 2. So here we go. What if we wanted to have a different feed coming in? All right. So we take our video input source here, which was our video loader, and our multiplex here. Let's duplicate those, bring that in. Let's also make duplicates of these video nulls, duplicating those down, putting them in line. Oh. And we are going to now, instead of taking it into the first port of this material, we are going to take it into the first port of this one over here. Now, we want to change this band shutterstock to base, so it's a different material. And over here, where we had our transform mode that was reversing it, we can also take the output of this bottom one and feed it into this transform. So this transform is now affecting both of them. So if we wanted to move it around and skew it up and down, it affects both the images. It just saves on some processing. Cool. Same thing as before. What if we wanted to color this up? Well, we could do the same effects, RGB distortion and some VHS scan lines, and we can link both of those in to this effect down here as well. But if we wanted to do the recolor, we can bring our own recolor in. So let's go recolor and recolor. We can come in and change our colors down here to something absolutely awful. But now we've got completely different colored TVs with completely different video feeds with different outsides. Now we can also say, all right, well, what about this look here, this truchette? Let's change that up. Let's throw in here another one of the fractal noise. Sorry, I'm going to go a little bit quicker here as I'm running a little short of time and I'm running off script. The fractal noise will come into our material color texture. The color ramp will feed into our fractal noise. And the fractal noise has a lot of options. So coming in here, going into the attributes. So if you're at the top of fractal noise, scrolling down, attributes, noise type, I'm going to come into where it says FBM and change it to marble. And this is closer to the one I have before. And you'll see this has actually got an animation option. So this will animate over time. So now we have an animated texture on the outside of it. If we wanted to animate our truchette, maybe we could come in and bring something called a continuous modifier. Now this does what you think it does. It'll just keep incrementing over time at a value of 1 per second on the speed. So if we come into our truchette and let's say we want to move this down in space over a certain amount of time over frames, we can take the output of our continuous modifier and feed it into the input of the Y. This is going a bit quick. So let's say we want to go minus 0.25. And now we have the pattern scrolling downwards at a constant rate. Now I'm not a big fan of this recolor I did. So I'm just going to remove those out. Okay, so we are now in the position where we have two looks on the screens in the grid, acting independently with different colored backgrounds and different sources to their TVs. What next? Now, remember in the first one, we had the image cloner and it had an image effector. Now, we can come back in again and add effectors to this look here. One of my favorite effectors is actually turbulence effector. So it's in here under cloning, effectors, turbulence effector. If you don't want to do it that way, just type TURB. One thing Notch does that's really, really useful is it color codes everything to their families, similar to what you would expect for the top stops and chops in Touch Designer. So as long as we're in the cloner space, which is green, we make sure we grab our cloner effector, drag that in. We make the output of the turbulence effector come into the cloner effectors. And now we can scroll down to the effector transform. This is how it's going to affect these objects. Again, before we changed the Z position, so why don't we do that again? Here we go. So now we're moving these around. Not bad. A little bit intense speed-wise. So we can come in and say, all right, we're going to go for our animation rate. We're going to drop that down to say 0.25. So it's something slower. The other thing we really want to do, especially if we're using these for videos that are going to keep playing continuously and not going to play for maybe a 30-second loop, is you always want to uncheck where it says lock to time code. Because what you'll find otherwise is when the playhead resets, I press home, everything will jump back to where it was. If I leave it as running loopable, it doesn't change the position no matter how many times I hit home. That also is a really good thing to remember for anything to do with math modifiers. Okay, so now we have moving, pushing forwards, images. What about that rotation? So we could come in here and say, all right, we're going to add our rotation here as well. So we can basically make it move around. But this is always going to be then linked that when it's forward, it's facing a direction, and when it's backward, it's facing another one. So let's add a second turbulence effector, hooking it back into our cloner. And then we want to say, all right, this is where we're going to start doing our rotation. So maybe say 45, 45, and 15. So these are going to jitter around quite a lot. Again, we haven't changed our animation speed. So let's drop that back down again to something like 0.6. So now our animation isn't going to be going quite so crazy. And we're also going to change that to running loopable. So now we've got them looking a little bit closer to where we were before. This one has a few more post effects on there and some different lighting, but we can tweak that still. So back on the subject of lighting, in our complete version, we have an environment map and some reflections, which is giving us this nice highlight in here. So we're going to recreate that next. Jumping back into the file we've been working on, and I probably should have said this earlier before I forgot, we should be saving continuously. So Control S will save. Otherwise, file and save, or file and save as up here. Sorry, that's one of the things I should have said right at the start. I've been very lucky we haven't had a crash, but that is an option to figure things out. So at the moment we have an ambient light, and that was just in to fill in some details. It's not the best, but it can work. One of the resources that should have been brought in with your Notch block, your Notch file, sorry, is this Shanghai Bund 8K HDRI image. If we drag it in, sorry, I have an itchy nose. Drag it in, hold shift and double click it. We can see that is a spherical 360 image for lighting. If you actually click on the video loader, you can preview it in viewport up here by clicking this button. Now this image can be used to actually light our scene from all directions. What we need to do here is drag in an environment map, ENVIR, environment map, Environment image works similar, but it's designed for the path tracing system. So I won't go into that today. So environment map. We are going to drag the video loader output into the environment map image. And again, nothing's really happening. We can make this run itself. So we're now connecting that to the root node. Still nothing's happening. Why is that? Well, if we want to have this affect just the materials by themselves, we need to come into the material bodies, scroll down on our materials till we see a bunch of checkboxes. And one of those checkboxes will be environment mapping. If we turn that on, suddenly it's being reflected everywhere. There is a different way of handling it though. We can use screen space reflections. So instead, if we make the screen space reflections connected to the root node, we take our environment map and feed it into our environment map input. And now we come into our materials and we adjust our metallicness to get some reflections. And we have to control. And we bring up our brightness. Oh, disregard. Deferred rendering. I forgot to turn on deferred rendering. So this is probably a good time to talk about the different rendering modes. So deferred rendering is required for if we're doing any sort of minor computational renders. We can then turn on high dynamic range. So we're not going to get as much banding as well coming through. We can set our anti-aliasing here, but I like to do that in post. And we can also, if we want, turn on linear space lighting to get things a bit more even lit. This will use a bit more processing power, but it's just going to be a different way of doing gamma space lighting to linear space. So now this is selected, we can see that background image is getting reflected really, really harshly. So we can come into our brightness and on the screen space reflections, turn our environment map brightness just down a bit. So if we highlight these, press Control-1, we can see the difference that makes. We can even take that completely off. And now it's just being the thing that's lighting the scene. Let's put our directional light back in. So recapping where we're at now. We have different colored TVs with different patterns, with different images on the screens, and they're moving around. So let's look at how we can make this a little bit more appealing to look at. F9, F9. I'm going to take these post effects off just because they're a little bit distracting for me. It's a bit easier to see like this. Let's look at some post nodes. So while we're putting things on our post effects directly to the screens by running them directly into our video nulls, as before, we can put post effect nodes on the entire scene. Again, I am going to use glow. I overuse glow on everything. I love glow. Glow is amazing. So a little bit of glow, dropping it down, and you can see we're getting a bit more of just some color coming through, that nice fringing. It's gonna be nice there. The next one we're gonna add is a color correction. Now this gives us the ability to change brightness curves. Crank our gamma just a little bit, brightness just a bit, and take our saturation maybe a little bit higher. It's probably a bit too intense, but this is the sort of look we're going for. And when we're working in Notch, you may be used to doing things like After Effects, where the bottommost effect will be sitting underneath another one. In Notch, it's the opposite. So the glow here is rendered first, and then the color effect is applied on top. So it's a top-down stack. If I change the order of this, it may not be super obvious here, but if I change the intensity, the glow is now being affected based on what is in the color correction. Whereas if I flip it now, the glow is happening first and the color correction is then happening on top of the glow. I like it this way. So we have a couple of effects here. One more I'm going to add, which I really like, is called the shift, tilt shift. If you're used to photography, tilt shift is the technique where you have a really shallow depth of field and your lens is kicked off to the side, and it gives the look that you're looking at a miniature sort of thing. Now, the way that they kind of cheat this in Notch is they blur the bottom and blur the top and get a nice slice in the middle. And as you'll see on my machine, even with a 2080 Ti, this absolutely tanked my performance. So there's a couple of different ways we can deal with this. First of all, it's going in the sprites mode. We can come straight to blur and we get our performance back. It doesn't look quite as nice, but still adds the effect. So let's just bring that in a bit more subtle, just so we have some subtle blur at the top and it's nice and clean in the middle. And we've maybe lost 2 frames of our performance there. Okay, we are 10 minutes away from a break, so I am going to jump into our camera animations quickly. So we have our look being fed into our post effect stack, being fed into our screens, which our cloner is then taking and making a grid of clones. We are pushing them forward with one turbulence effector, and we are rotating them around with a second. So our camera. We dragged our camera in earlier, set it to 10, but we've been mainly using the orbit cam. So if we press 0 again now, we can go to this camera in here. Now, I like to name the cameras. So F5 main cam. And the reason I like to do that is because when you're clicking anywhere in the outside of your node graph, it thinks you're clicking on the root node. And you can change the currently playing camera. So I can go perspective left, top view, or main cam. It's just a really easy way of making sure this one's always known. Another thing to keep in consideration, if you have multiple cameras, let me duplicate this one, and I offset them one across. The stacking order matters. So right now, because this camera is above the other camera, that is the first camera that the render stack sees looking down, and that will be the camera that is affected. This also works left to right. So again, Notch works from top to the bottom and from left to right if it sees the node of the same type and it's trying to figure out which one is the most important node. So we have this. We want to make our camera move side to side. Not so much it gives people seasick, but just pans across our images. In Touch Designer, you might use something like an LFO. And the option to that in here is our math modifier. So inside our modifiers, there were all those ones we showed earlier. And we used the math before in Perl and noise mode. We're now going to use it in sine mode. So in our camera here, we can actually take our math modifier, click on our camera, and caution, this is going to get a little dizzy straight away until we fix it. We drag from the math modifier to the X position. Now that's hurting my eyes. So I'm going to press spacebar to stop it from moving. The way we control this is we come into our math modifier and we can adjust our scale, offset, and speed. And speed is the big one here. I'm going to change this to 0.25. So it's getting a little bit more subtle. One thing I like to do is I like to work in multiples of 4 or power of 2. That way, you know, if you want to change things by half, you're always going to keep like a half of a beat. So 0.25 or 0.125. So now our camera is going to move side to side a bit more. Let's say it wants to go a little bit further. So we can change our math modifier again, come into the scale mode and change that to 3. Now it's going to move further across. Similar to how we had going before, not quite exactly. Maybe we want to say, we also want this to change how it tilts up and down. So we can throw in, what else in the modifier stack have we got that we haven't used recently? Beat pulse. Okay, this is a good one. So our beat pulse modifier does what you expect it to do. It gives you a kick of a value every beat. So let's say we wanted to use this beat pulse and we were doing a music video or a music clip, and we wanted to make the camera push in. What we do is we take our main camera, we take the output of our beat pulse modifier, and we'd feed it into our position Z. And now on the beat, we're getting that camera kicking in nicely. Might be a little bit harsh for what we want, maybe a bit too fast. We can adjust the number of beats and the BPM here. So we can say 0.5 beats. So every 2 beats at 120 BPM, that's going to be kicking in. All right, we're getting pretty close. We've got 5 minutes more here. So I am going to say now is probably a good time to start cleaning up and renaming our files. So we've got one section at the top here, which we can call TV1 or our first TV. So let's grab our second lot of TVs, which is linked to the bottom, and drag it down below. So we can separate these two zones. Now these things in the middle, all these effects, feed both looks, so we can keep them in the middle. But if we come in and we say, let's just condense all of our video effects. Drag this across just so it's a bit smaller. And let's move our cloner up. I'm going to do something called using regions. So if we come across to our node list here, REGION, region, not region camera, something completely different. But our regions, if we drag them in, we actually get this little colored box. Now, it's hard to see, but there are little dark squares in the corners we can use to click and drag. Now, this is really, really good at saying, all right, this zone is one particular group of objects. It also really helps that everything that's fully inside this region, if you hold down the shift button and click and drag on the name, you can move it all as one unit. So again, like we had before, we can click on this region. It brings up some options. The comment, the name, let's just call this TV1. We want to say, all right, the TV1, the color is pink in this truechat. So we can come into this region and make it more of a pink color. We can also say this TV1 label is really hard to read. So I'm going to go extra large. And now from just looking around your node graph, you can immediately see this is our TV1. It's the fastest way to sort of recognize where things are. So let's duplicate this one. So we click on our region, move down a bit further and press Control D. Now, when you duplicate with Control D, you will spawn the object or the node at wherever your mouse pointer is. So if we go across here, across here. So we can now take this TV1 we've made, click on it, change the color to blue, change the name to TV2, and we can just put all of our nodes inside it. And now we've quickly set up two regions. If we're jumping back across to our complete zone here, I've gone through and set all of these up into different regions, including what you've seen before, which is the TV post effects that were isolated to those two looks, and the scene post effects in their own one there. Okay, so the next thing we will be looking at, as we're pretty much in the optimization phase of this now, is we're going to start looking at, after the break in 13 minutes time, we're going to look at how to start controlling some of these effects. We're going to look at starting to expose some of these values. So when we export this block from a media server, we can control things like the color of the TV or the speed of the bounce or which input is where. We're also going to start using things like modifiers to link multiples of these together. So if we want to switch both of these multiplex sources at once, how would we do that? Sorry, drank too much orange juice earlier. And we're going to just talk about how we can tie all of this together. So that will take about 15 minutes after the break to a half an hour. And after that, I'm going to open it up to some questions and answers. There are a couple I can see in the Q&A box here. But yeah, I might say, let's throw to break 1 minute early. I'm going to bring it across to the break slide, which is across here. And after the break, we can jump back in and we'll get the final tweaks done and we can export these out and you can use them in your show straight away. Cool, cool. Nariman?
Okay, thank you so for that session too. Yeah, okay. Take break to dive in session 3 with Clear Brain. Thank you. Okay, so see you soon after 10 minutes.